Hello, everyone. It's good to see you all in the chat. We've got quite a lot of people joining, still coming in. But yeah, so welcome to a new Getting to Know Japan webinar. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jeff Mazziata, the Activities Coordinator here at YCAPS. Of course, I'm also joined in today and stepping in for our usual host and program director of this series, Amani Kidd, who's doing the behind-the-scenes stuff today. So also today, along with myself and Amani, we're joined by Dr. Robert Hoppens, who'll be presenting on Japanese history 1945 to the present. So a little bit about Dr. Hoppens. Dr. Hoppens received a PhD in modern Japanese history from the University of Washington and is associate professor of history at the University of Texas Rio Grande Valley, where he teaches Japanese, Chinese, Korean, and world history. His research focuses on the history of Sino-Japanese relations, Japan-Taiwan relations, Cold War history, and issues of national identity in East Asia. He's also the author of The China Problem in Post-War Japan, Japanese National Identity and Sino-Japanese Relations, published by Bloomsbury Press as part of the series SOAS Studies in Modern and Contemporary Japan. He's also a member of the fourth cohort of the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Foundation's U.S.-Japan Network for the Future. We do a lot of great work alongside of the Mansfield Foundation there. So thanks to them as well. One final note I'd like to mention is a kind reminder to everyone to refrain from turning on your microphones during today's event, so the duration of the event, of the recording and presentation. We want to avoid any hot mic issues so that we can make sure we can hear our presenter clearly. I'll also be sharing a link to our presenter's book a little bit later if you're interested in reading more of his work. That being said, that's all I've got for the opening bit here. So I will pass the microphone, if you will, over to our presenter who will be talking for us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jeff and Amani. Thank you both, and thanks to YCAPS for having me. As the title of the talk is Japanese History, 1945 to the present. As you'll see, I'm not going to make it anywhere near the present. I'll try to make it through basically the end of the Cold War, and I'll spend quite a bit of time on the occupation of Japan as sort of the foundation for post-war Japanese history, and then I'll talk about the history of the Cold War, Japanese politics, Japanese economy, and say a little bit about Japanese society during the Cold War. So let me begin. In 1945, we'll begin with the surrender of Japan. On August 15th, 1945, the Japanese emperor read the imperial rescript on surrender, in which he announced that because the enemy had developed a, quote, new and most cruel bomb, in order to save Japan and to save all of human civilization, the emperor had decided to end the war. Though in the rescript, he never mentions the word surrender or says that Japan lost the war. At the same time, the rescript also called on the Japanese to endure the unendurable, which meant basically to cooperate with the forthcoming Allied occupation. On September 2nd, 1945, then, General MacArthur accepts the Japanese surrender aboard the USS Missouri. At the time, the USS Missouri was flying the American flag that flew at the White House on Pearl Harbor Day, and the flag that Commodore Perry had flown when he arrived in Japan all the way back in 1853. So a moment redolent with a long history of U.S.-Japan relations. With the surrender of Japan, then, Japan comes under the occupation of a foreign power for the first time in its history. The wartime Japanese government and the Showa emperor had presided over the greatest catastrophe in Japanese history. The war itself, as made famous by John Dower's book, was a vicious, quote, war without mercy, characterized by racist propaganda and a determination to fight to the end on both sides. The American populace was in the grips of a harshly anti-Japanese public opinion that largely favored revenge and a punitive occupation. The actual occupation, however, resulted in a settlement that confounded all of these expectations. It was largely lenient, geared toward far reaching, liberal, sometimes even radical political, economic, and social reforms under the aegis of a military occupation that ended up creating a democracy that at the same time retained not only the imperial institution, but the very same emperor in whose name Japanese troops had fought in China and the Pacific War. And the occupation finally ended in a military alliance between the United States and Japan that endures to the present day. So it'd be very difficult to overestimate the importance of the American occupation of Japan. So let's turn to that next. The occupation was nominally an Allied occupation, but in fact, it was largely an American enterprise. Not just the Soviet Union, but also many of Japan's Asian victims, including China, had next to no role in making policy during the occupation. They were largely sidelined by the American commander of Allied forces in Japan, General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur was Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers at his SCAP. That's his title, but it comes to refer to the occupation in general. MacArthur received general directives from Washington, but had a wide discretionary power in making occupation policy. There wasn't much in MacArthur's background to suggest a radical reformer. He was a perennial conservative presidential candidate, but he did have an almost unshakable belief in the universality and superiority of American cultural and political institutions. MacArthur came to see American style democracy as a cure for all of Japan's supposed ills that had led them to war. MacArthur himself said, quote, "Never will a free people voluntarily associate itself with the proposition that the road to war, or the road to peace and well-being and happiness lies through the crucible of war." This belief in democracy and American values was also famously reinforced by certain paternalistic assumptions about Japanese national character and the capability of reform. MacArthur famously once referred to the Japanese as a nation of 12-year-olds that could be re-educated and disciplined to become democratic and peaceful in the American mold. Uh, the Japanese, for their part, also in again to quote another title of another of John Dower's books, okay, embraced defeat in many ways. There was very little violent opposition to the occupation. The Japanese populace itself were exhausted by the demands of the war, especially its increasingly harsh last days. The Japanese military and political establishment had been largely delegitimized by the defeat. And the war had also proven that to many Japanese that the Japanese couldn't compete with the economic and military power of Japan. That Japan was no longer what, since the Meiji Restoration, they had pursued to be a first rank power. MacArthur himself bluntly called Japan, in the wake of defeat, a quote, fourth rate nation. The picture here is from the first meeting between General Douglas MacArthur and the Japanese Showa Emperor Hirohito. The picture itself was printed in Japanese newspapers and became a sensation at the time as largely illustrative of the new relationship between Japan and the United States. MacArthur towering over the much shorter Japanese emperor at ease with an open shirt collar, while the Japanese emperor is dressed in formal wear. One of the first decisions MacArthur had to make was what to do with the emperor. There's strong sentiment in the United States and other allied countries at the time against the imperial institution and in favor of trying the emperor as a war criminal. But MacArthur claims to be impressed with the emperor on his first meeting, claiming that the emperor had taken all responsibility for the war and asked MacArthur not to take revenge on the Japanese people. MacArthur also thought the emperor could be useful to the occupation and feared Japanese resistance to the occupation should the emperor be removed, and estimated that American troops might be needed to maintain stability should the Americans try to abolish the imperial institution. And so the MacArthur comes to the decision to maintain not just the imperial institution, but also to keep Hirohito himself on the throne in order to lend legitimacy to occupation reforms. Part of the problem here is that the Americans had to follow a policy of indirect rule through the existing Japanese government. The Americans lacked the personnel and as well as things like the language skills and familiarity with Japanese society to carry out a direct rule in Japan. And so much of the Japanese bureaucracy remained intact after the during the occupation, and occupation policies were basically enacted through the Japanese government. Okay. We can divide the occupation, or historians conventionally divide the occupation into sort of two different periods. Characterized by their policies. The first phase for the first 2 or 3 years of the occupation is a period of radical reform under the buzzwords demilitarization and democratization. And then the second period, beginning in about 1947, 1948, to the end of the occupation in 1952, is often referred to as the reverse course, in which many of these more radical reforms are muted in order to focus more on the reconstruction of Japan as a Cold War American ally in Asia. And so please let me go through the demilitarization and democratization period in some detail. We can get to the reverse course and the Cold War after. Okay, demilitarization should be fairly self-descriptive. Okay, demilitarization was meant to eliminate Japan as a threat to the United States or its Asian neighbors. It included the abolition of the empire, meaning that Japan was reduced to the 4 main islands along with other minor islands. Japan renounced all its claims to territories gained since 1895, the first war with China, including Taiwan, Korea, Manchuria, and other territories in the Pacific. The Ryukyu Islands, that is Okinawa and the Bonin Islands, those remained under United States military control in a trusteeship. Okinawa all the way until 1972 when it was returned to Japanese administration. Demilitarization also, and most importantly, involved disbanding the Japanese military. So the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy were abolished, along with the Army and Navy ministries. This also included the abolition of the military police, the Kempeitai, as well as the special hire police, the Toko, the civilian secret, sometimes called thought police in Japan. Beginning in 1946, a purge was carried out to remove anyone who had collaborated with Japan's war effort from political and business positions in Japan. Anyone who was found to have promoted, quote, Japanese aggression or militant nationalism. This was aimed at politicians, military officers, leaders of nationalist organizations, business organizations, colonial officials, journalists, and publishers. Some 220,000 people were made ineligible to hold public office, and something like 80% of the House of Representatives were removed from office. The capstone of the demilitarization effort was the Tokyo war crimes trials that sought to determine, to bring justice to those responsible for the war. It took 2 years in through 1948. The tribunal included judges from various allied countries, including judges from China, the Philippines, and India, and prosecuted those who were deemed responsible for planning and carrying out Japan's aggressive aggression, dating all the way back to the Manchurian incident of 1931. In the end, 25 people were brought to trial. 16 were sentenced to life terms, 1 to 20 years, and 1 to 8 years. In addition to this, 7 were hanged as Class A war criminals. The Tokyo war crimes trials are fairly well known, but it should probably be pointed out that these are not the only war crimes trials in Asia. That war crimes trials prosecuting what are called B and C class war criminals were held all throughout East Asia, from China to the Philippines to Southeast Asia. And these B and C class criminals were charged with what we might call ordinary war crimes. In these lesser B and C class war crimes trials, a total of 6,000 people were tried for war crimes. Over 900 of them were executed. And it should probably be pointed out that the Japanese military forces did not include only ethnic Japanese, that some of the people who were tried and executed in these other war crimes trials included Koreans and Taiwanese who had served in the Japanese military during the war. Uh, Today, the Tokyo war crimes trials are the subject of considerable controversy. Okay, they were almost from the beginning. Judge Paul, the Indian judge, filed the lone dissenting opinion in 1948, who didn't Paul didn't deny Japanese atrocities, but instead argued that colonial powers had no right to hold the Japanese accountable. In the 1960s and 1970s, revisionist scholars in the United States and the West also took another look at the Tokyo war crimes trials and found them to smack of, quote, victor's justice. And today, of course, the Tokyo war crimes trials are the particular target of Japanese conservative nationalists who, including people like former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo and the current Prime Minister Takaichi Sanai, who see it as largely concur with this view of victor's justice. It should be pointed out that at the time, the Tokyo war crimes trial view of history was, in fact, almost the opposite of what Japanese conservatives consider it today. That the sort of the point of the war crimes trials was to identify those few militarists who had, in the view of American leaders, led Japan astray, were accountable for leading the Japanese nation and people who were largely innocent of these war crimes into the war. And this is perhaps most famously illustrated by the decision not to try the emperor for war crimes trials. And in fact, the war crimes trials were carefully orchestrated to avoid any mention or any intimation of the emperor's complicity in Japan's war efforts or war crimes. Okay, so demilitarization was meant to make Japan ensure that Japan never became a military threat to the United States or its neighbors. Democratization was to remake Japan into a democratic nation. This included as soon as the occupation forces arrived in Japan, restrictions on speech and assembly were lifted. About 2,500 political prisoners, including communists, many of whom had been in prison for years for opposing the war, were released. There was also the abolition of what the Americans called state Shinto, that through the 1945 Shinto Directive established Shinto as a religion along with other religions and banned created separation of church and state, and banned ideological use of Shinto by the state. Part of this abolition of state Shinto included reinventing the emperor. So on New Year's Day in 1946, Hirohito delivered his famous Declaration of Humanity, in which he renounced the idea that he was a living god or divine, or that his political position was sacred or inviolable, had been laid out in the Meiji Constitution of 1868, and also included, as illustrated in this picture here, national tour by Emperor Hirohito, where he went out in civilian clothes to meet the Japanese populace in an unprecedented sort of meeting of the common folk of Japan for the Japanese emperor. Just as the war crimes trials were sort of the capstone to the demilitarization movement, so the Constitution was to be the capstone to the democratization process. MacArthur had originally hoped that the Constitution could be rewritten by the Japanese government, but when several drafts failed to go far enough in reform, MacArthur ordered the government section of SCAP under General Courtney Whitney to draft a constitution. They were instructed to retain the emperor as a constitutional monarch responsible to the electorate, and that war and war-making ability would be forsworn. So SCAP government section sat down and in 6 days came up with a constitution that was presented to the Japanese government for ratification. And it was eventually ratified by the Japanese government and came into force in 1947. We can't go through all the terms of the Constitution, but most famously, the Constitution made the emperor, quote, a symbol of the state and unity of the people. Sovereignty now resided with the Japanese people. Most famously, perhaps, is Article 9 of the Constitution, in which Japan renounced the right to wage war or maintain military forces. The Diet now, both houses were elected by universal suffrage. Universal suffrage here now including, for the first time, the right for women to vote in national elections. The Constitution also included a whole host of civil and human rights, including freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom, academic freedom, equality of the sexes, the right to collective bargaining. Many of these drafted by Betty Sirota Gordon, who was the only woman on the board to write the Constitution, who wrote in extensive clauses in the Constitution related to women's rights, including Article 14, which outlawed the discrimination on the basis of race, creed, sex, or social status, Article 24, which declared equality of sexes in marriage, and Article 26, which declared the equality of sexes in education. The 1947 Constitution, despite being written by a foreign occupying force, is still in effect. This is still the occupation, or this is still the Constitution that Japanese live under today. And not only is it still in effect, it has never been amended since 1947. Very quickly, I might mention that it wasn't just political democratization that was aimed that the occupation aimed at. That reforms went further and in many ways were more radical. The occupation also aimed for economic democratization. They saw the domination of the Japanese economy by large industrial conglomerates called the zaibatsu as part of the explanation for Japan's road to war. And so many of these zaibatsu, these large industrial conglomerates, were broken up. There was support on the part of the occupation authorities for the labor movement and for unionization. And perhaps most radically, the occupation carried out a land reform in Japan, in which the total size of land holdings for any one household were limited. Any land holdings above that limit were forced to be sold to the state, which then sold these lands to poor tenant farmers. So this is a land distribution, okay, in which landowners are forcibly expropriated of their property, though with compensation, and it is redistributed to farmers in Japan's rural society. In the context of the United States, in context of U.S. politics, okay, this would be an incredibly radical step to take. The upshot of this is about the land reform affected the property rights of about 6 million families in Japan. Land tenancy rates in Japan decreased from about 40% to less than 10%, and really transformed rural Japan into a society of small, independent family farms who ultimately became staunch conservatives and supporters of the post war political order. Uh, the occupation authorities also aimed to reform what they saw as less than modern aspects of Japanese culture, let's put it that way, okay, in which not only Japanese political institutions, but Japanese society and even culture needed to be reformed. Many of the reforms targeted the position of women in Japanese society. The Constitution and other legal reforms sought to reform the patriarchal family system, under which the male head of household was the legal representative of the family under Meiji period law. Marriage was to be by mutual consent, equal rights between husband and wife, when women were to have equal rights to inheritance and to initiate divorce. And most importantly, as I mentioned earlier, under the new constitution, women were granted the right to vote for the first time in Japanese history. And in the 1946 election, 39 women were elected to the Diet. Another aspect of this social reform included education reform that sought to root out militaristic influences within the Japanese educational system. The Fundamental Law of Education in 1947 created basically an American school system of single track coeducational schools in Japan, with local school boards in control of staff, curriculum, and texts. Okay, it also included the creation and use of new textbooks, the abolition of morals courses, and revisions especially to history courses that sought to get rid of references to the imperial myths. And in fact, these reforms also created a powerful teachers' union that came to be dominated by leftists and socialists and became the bête noire of the conservative political establishment. Okay, by the time you get to 1947 and 1948, however, as the Cold War heats up first in Europe and then in China and on the Korean Peninsula, the focus of the occupation shifts from reform to looking to rebuild Japan and its economy in order to contribute to the Cold War in East Asia. There was less tolerance of labor on the part of SCAP, and famously in February 1948, SCAP blocks a general strike supported by the Japan Communist Party, which is often seen as one of the major events marking the beginning of this reverse course. A new public service law made it illegal for government employees to strike. The Purge is brought back in 1949, this time leveled at communists and leftists. And over 20,000 alleged communists are removed from their positions in the public and private sector under the reverse course. The economic reforms also began to slow down. The Zaibatsu dissolution slows down. Okay, there are limits placed on war reparations to Japan's victims during the war. Okay, and most remarkably was the reverse course on defense. Just A few years after writing Article 9 into the Japanese Constitution, the United States begins to put pressure on Japan to rearm and increase defense spending, which eventually leads to the creation of a 75,000 man police reserve that later in 1954 became the basis for the Japan Self Defense Force, which still exists today. The occupation comes to an end in 1952 through a series of treaties. One is the San Francisco Peace Treaty of 1951 that ends the occupation, but is not signed by the USSR or most communist nations. At the same time that the San Francisco Peace Treaty is signed, so is the first U.S.-Japan Security Treaty that allows the United States to maintain military bases in Japan even after independence. And as I said before, Okinawa remains under direct U.S. military control until 1972. At the San Francisco Peace Conference in 1951, no Chinese government is represented. Okay, Japan eventually in 1952 signs a peace treaty that recognizes the Republic of China on Taiwan under Chiang Kai-shek as the official government of China, and Japan would have no relations with the People's Republic of China established in 1949 until in 1972 after Nixon's dramatic visit to China in 1971. Okay, so these reforms and of the occupation, especially the Constitution, set the framework for post-war Japanese politics. The occupation had been the heyday of the leftist forces in Japan. Okay? But despite the popularity of the leftists in the early occupation and early independence period, post-war politics come to be dominated by conservatives. And the man most responsible for this is Yoshida Shigeru, who had been a former pre-war foreign ministry bureaucrat who served as prime minister and foreign minister throughout much of the occupation. Many conservative politicians had been purged under the occupation, and so Yoshida begins to recruit into the Conservative Party a whole raft of former bureaucrats who become known as the Yoshida School, who carry out what some scholars have called the Yoshida Doctrine of post-war Japanese politics. And the Yoshida Doctrine has three main tenets. Okay, one is to focus on economic development. In order to focus on economic development, Japan needs to limit rearmament and avoid international military entanglements. In order to do this, then Japan would have to maintain an alliance with the United States for defense. And this basic policy comes to characterize post-war Japanese politics all the way through the end of the Cold War. In 1955, socialist parties merged to create the Japan Socialist Party. In response to this, two major Japanese conservative parties, the Liberal Party and the Democratic Party, merged to form the LDP. And this creates what comes to be called by historians of Japan, okay, the 1955 system, in which you have two major powers, the LDP and the JSP. But unlike the two-party system in the United States, one party, the Liberal Democratic Party, wins every election and dominates every government from 1955 all the way through the end of the Cold War until 1993. Okay? So you have a basically two-party system, but with a ruling conservative party, the LDP, and an opposition JSP, and some minor parties like the Japan Communist Party or the Komeito, founded by the Buddhist organization Soka Gakkai. Okay? And I'm sure you're all aware, okay, that the current Prime Minister Takaichi Sanai is also from the Liberal Democratic Party. So this dominance by the Liberal Democratic Party continues even to the present day. Okay, let me skip forward to talk very briefly about the Japanese economy, okay? And we can begin to perhaps turn over the presentation to the question and answer period. No one would have predicted it back in 1945 or even probably 1952 when Japan became independent. But Japan's economy not only recovers from the disaster of the war, but grows so rapidly that people start to use the word miracle to describe it. Between 1955 and 1973, the Japanese GN economy grows at an average rate of more than 10% per year. And by 1973, Japan had emerged as the world's third largest economy behind the United States and the Soviet Union, a position it maintains today, now behind the United States and the People's Republic of China in terms of sheer size of the economy. We can divide the post-war history of Japan's economy into four periods. First is a period of rapid economic growth, and you can see this here in this top chart, okay, where the economy is growing very often at rates above 10%. This period of high economic growth is brought to an end by the first oil shock in 1973 that provokes the first recession in Japan since 1955. Okay? But the Japanese economy recovers fairly rapidly from the oil shock, and by 1985 has recovered so much that in the Plaza Accord, there's an attempt to address Japan's trade deficit with the United States by revaluing and raising the value of the Japanese yen, which leads to the bubble economy, a rapid rise in asset prices, especially real estate prices and stock prices in Japan. This was a period from 1985 to 1990 when you would hear estimates that the grounds of the Imperial Palace in Tokyo were worth more than all the land in California, or that the fears that the Japanese were going to buy up all of the United States as they purchased things like Pebble Beach Golf Course and the Rockefeller Center in New York. This comes to an end in 1990 when the stock market and real estate markets in Japan crash and bring on what the Japanese come to call the lost decade of the 1990s. And since then, the Japanese economy, as you can see in the chart here at the top, has grown at an average rate of about 1%. Okay, this rapid economic growth creates a common aspiration to a middle class lifestyle that changes Japanese life, especially in urban areas. There's a massive influx of people into urban areas and the expansion of suburban housing. Huge apartment complexes called danchi. That you can see pictures of them here. And this middle class lifestyle is spread by the media, especially TV. And the access to this middle class lifestyle is achieved, okay, through employment and education. Okay, then I'll just mention, okay, that sort of the image of this middle class lifestyle is the salaryman lifestyle, the white collar worker who endures long commutes from the suburbs to the city center, but also enjoys the benefits of the Japanese employment system, things like lifetime employment, seniority pay, and the bonus system. Blue collar workers also see their salaries rise by about 10% per year during the high growth period, which means that it's not just the salaryman and white collar workers, but blue collar workers who see their living standards increase. And by the time you get to the 1970s and 1980s in public opinion polls, something like 90% of Japanese answer that they consider themselves middle class. Uh, Famously, okay, to become a salaryman, you have to go through the grueling Japanese education system that includes the exam system and examination hell, in which school life becomes a gauntlet of high stakes examinations to get into first universities, okay, but eventually high schools, junior high schools, and even in some cases kindergartens who test mothers in exams rather than their children. I should point out that this middle class lifestyle was very different for women, okay, and it had a gendered component that women did not generally enjoy the benefits of the Japanese employment system. They were usually relegated to what in Japanese came to be called OL, in which they performed secretarial and service duties and were expected upon marriage to become professional housewives and retire into the the private household management. Okay? Changes in this household structure also lead to changes in the birth rate and demographic shifts that I probably don't have to tell you are the subject of considerable consternation and debate in Japan today. Let me leave it there, okay? And I'll turn it over to Jeff and the Q&A portion of the talk.
Perfect. So I've got a few questions, and then I noticed we have quite a lot from the chat. On some of the questions of the chat, I'll try to organize them. We kind of went chronologically, so we've got a few questions regarding the occupation era. Then we've got a couple more looking at the economic growth era. And of course, please, I welcome any more questions into the chat as we continue through. Um, I do want to start. I have a couple questions. I had one from Amani. I wanted to ask your thoughts on. So Amani asked, she mentions that we constantly see Japan becoming more and more conservative in her view. She asked, besides maintaining traditions and culture, is there a benefit of a more conservative society and maintaining a dominant kind of one-party conservative rule for the Japanese people, in your opinion? Or is there
I
not?
don't know if there's a, I don't know if I'd try to argue that there's a benefit of conservative party rule, but a lot of explanations have been offered for this, for why the LDP managed to dominate post-war Japanese society, especially when, if you go back to the 1950s and even the 1960s, leftist positions were very popular. Uh, Part of it has to do with uh, simply the economic performance. If you go back, if you're talking about the high growth period, the fact that the LDP delivered rapid economic growth is a considerable explanation for their dominance at the polls. Another explanation would be, as I mentioned, the land reform. And that farmers and rural areas became bastions of support for the Conservative Party, which may sound familiar to Americans. Okay, and that this is so this is part of the explanation is the support from rural areas. And throughout much of the up until the 1990s, rural areas were systematically overrepresented in Japanese electoral politics. I think political scientists would tell you. Part of the credit has to go to the LDP itself, that the LDP was pretty successful, especially after the 1960 security treaty demonstrations that I didn't have time to go into, in co-opting leftist positions, so that, for example, the adoption of the three non-nuclear principles by Sato Eisaku, the commitment to keeping defense spending under 1%, okay? The commitment to maintaining what Ikeda Hayato called a low posture on divisive political topics like revising the Constitution. Okay. Also in the 1970s, they co-opted leftist positions on things like social welfare spending, addressing pollution concerns, that the LDP, when pushed, could be proactive enough to co-opt popular positions from the left. Probably I should also mention quite a bit of funding for the Japanese party, Japanese conservatives from the CIA that lasted throughout the 1950s into the 1960s, that helped fund conservative candidates. And even today, I saw a presentation by Dan Smith, who is a political scientist, who wrote an article called Winning Elections with Unpopular Policies, in which he argues that many of the LDP's policies today don't poll very well, but much of the today, much of the conservative dominance probably can be ascribed to a lack of really attractive opposition parties in Japan.
Very good, very
So that would
good.
be a very long answer to that question.
Yeah, I have my own question as well, but it's more related to potential predictions. So I'll save that for later. I'll get into some of the audience questions. First, I'll have some of the questions related to the occupation. We had quite a lot of these, so I might have to come back
Sure.
to them later because I want to give equal footing to other areas. But we did have a few questions relating to uh, you know the post-war era in Germany and Europe versus Japan and some of the differences or similarities. So I wanted to
Okay.
mention that. We had a basic question about, did the US have like a Marshall Plan or Marshall Program for Japan and Asia as there was for Germany and Europe? We also had, I might combine some of these if you want to take them as a
Mm.
whole. We also had a question regarding the Nuremberg trials versus the Tokyo trials. Did they have any influence over each other? And then also a touch base on the recognition of war guilt being quite different
Okay.
from Germany and Japan. So I'll present those three, and if you want to kind of touch on those topics.
Okay. So first, the first one. Can you remind me what the first one was?
The first one, apologies, was the related to the Marshall Plan. So we had the
Okay.
Marshall Plan, obviously in Europe, for recovery effort, and was there a similar plan in Japan and Asia?
Yes, there was economic aid to Japan during the occupation. At first, there was not much sympathy for the plight of the Japanese who faced starvation in the first year after surrender in 1945. But pretty soon, American food aid began to flow into Japan, and then more extensive economic aid. I don't think it was, I can't recall off the top of my head. There's a whole bunch of different aid programs and I can't remember the acronyms and names for all of them. I don't remember, one organized sort of aid vision for Japan that would be equivalent to the Marshall Plan. But yes, economic aid was provided to the Japanese, first food aid and then economic aid. Uh, the next one was about the war crimes trials.
Yes.
Okay,
Do they
so
have influence
yes,
on each other?
the Tokyo war crimes trials were conceived as the Far Eastern equivalent of the Nuremberg trials, and they charged Japanese with the same crimes they charged Nazi leaders with: crimes against humanity, crimes against peace. Some things that I've read would point out that the trials in Japan, I think, took longer, and maybe sort of public interest in Japan began to wane in the war crimes trials by the time verdicts were actually announced. But the goal was that the Tokyo war crimes trials would be the Far Eastern equivalent of the Nuremberg trials.
Yeah.
And then the last one, was there one more about war guilt?
Yes, so Wargate. So that I actually was going to mention if I could pull in another question into the to
Sure.
make it even more complicated for you because it kind of tails off of those. We had a comment question about the concept of victor's justice.
Okay.
Just to reinterpret what he said, I was wondering in the context between obviously Europe and that post-war and Japan, can you talk more about the pushback and for to that victor's justice that we're seeing from conservative parties? How that compares in context to others, victors' justice, other regions, or potentially other wars. Was that in line, out of line? Is there a foot to stand on for that pushback saying it was unfair? And that I guess can also go into the war guilt and the way that we're looking at the war post-war.
There are some legal grounds for criticisms of both the Nuremberg and the Tokyo war crimes trials. And I should preface this by I am not a legal expert, nor am I an expert on the war crimes trials themselves. But some people have, have said that there are legal problems with these crimes against humanity, crimes against peace, which were pretty unprecedented in international law before World War II. Uh, in terms of the pushback on the war crimes trials, certainly the inconsistencies and who was held responsible, the fact that the emperor wasn't prosecuted, the fact that, you've probably heard of Unit 731, which carried out biological warfare experiments in China, just like in Nazi Germany, just like in Operation Paperclip, a lot of the people who were responsible for Unit 731 were not tried. So there's considerable inconsistencies in who was held responsible. That could be grounds for criticism. As I said, Judge Paul wrote a dissenting our decision in which he argued that colonial powers were in no position to hold the Japanese accountable for atrocities that imperialists had committed in Asia all throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Okay. On the other hand, the Chinese and Philippine judges didn't have problems condemning both Japanese and Western imperialism. You won't be surprised to learn that, Judge Paul is a hero of the Japanese right wingers. And if you go to the Yushukan, which is the war museum at Yasukuni Shrine, there's a bust to him. But as I said, I think a lot of it really has certainly less to do with sort of legal technicalities than it does with identity politics in Japan. And just the fact that many conservatives, like people elsewhere in other colonial contexts, often do not want to accept sort of historical narratives that challenge their identities as good people, okay, or the nation that they identify as capable of or complicit in or guilty of war crimes or imperialist repression of people in Taiwan or Korea, just like there's pushback against teaching too much imperial history in European countries, okay, or in the United States, teaching too much about race and
Yes, I
racism.
have my own thoughts on it as well, but I'll save that for another day so we can get to some of these other questions. Let's shift it a little bit. We had a few questions that talked about more recent trends or moving into the Cold War and beyond. Um, we had a question from Patricia, and she was curious about the economic growth that we saw in 55 to 73, and what factors do you think fueled that growth? Was it American and business influence rebuilding the country from post-war devastation? Were there any other major factors? Was it just, this Japanese economic miracle? Was it Japanese pulling themselves up by their bootstraps? What might you say?
Yeah, like explaining the dominance of the LDP, this could be a really long answer. And there are several explanatory factors. One is that, remember, Japan had created an industrial economy before the war. That infrastructure and material had all been destroyed during the American bombing, but a lot of it just needed to be rebuilt. Okay, when Japan rebuilt, then there's a kind of what my advisor called the advantages of followership or the advantages of backwardness, that when new steel mills were built, then they were brand new in the 1950s and 1960s, where much of American industrial infrastructure dated from, the 30s or the 40s or something like that. There's also, of course, then the Cold War context, that the post-war period was a period of trade expansion all over the world. It was the beginning of, what today we would call globalization, the Bretton Woods Agreement, the IMF, the World Bank, the GATT that lowered tariffs all around the world. So Japan was recovering in a period in which global trade was expanding very rapidly. There's also then American sponsorship. It was very important to American Cold War planners, okay, that the whole point of the Cold War is to prove the superiority of capitalism. Okay, that capitalism is more productive, can raise living standards, lead to more peace and prosperity than communism. So it was in American interest to foster the growth of the Japanese economy. And so the Japanese had access to the American market for their exports, access to American technology that they could import. Okay, much of which today, okay, if you listen to you know the President Trump talk about it. Okay, this was the Americans getting screwed, but it should probably be pointed out that Americans allowed Japanese access to the American market and US technology, not because they were stupid, not because uh, you know they were getting ripped off, but they saw it as but because they were Cold Warriors. And so the Cold War context is an important part of this. And you could also talk about Japan had good economic fundamentals, very high savings rates, an educated workforce, an expanding workforce in the post-war period. Okay? And finally, we could probably point out industrial policy that the Japanese ministries like Ministry of Finance and Ministry of International Trade and Industry uh, had laws that controlled foreign capital in Japan and could direct capital to targeted industries. Okay, and of course, it was much easier to target industries when you all you had to do was catch up to the most advanced economies like the United States.
Great. We have quite a lot of questions. I apologize, everyone in the chat. We're not going to be able to get to all of them, but I'm trying to be equitable as best I can. To talk a little bit more about current day Japan, you did mention on social democratization as part of a
Mm-hmm.
big push post occupation and all this, well, occupation and beyond. We had a question. You mentioned things like women's suffrage and women's rights. We had a question from Elizabeth in the chat. Uh, Elizabeth Riddler. She wanted to know a little bit more if you could touch base more on the current position of women in Japan society. So I guess like how do you see that social democratization? How do you see those effects? Where do you see it being today?
Yes. So again, I need a little bit of a caveat here that
Quick
I'm not an
version. It's
expert
okay.
in contemporary Japanese uh, gender politics or society. But one thing to point out is, of course, it's one thing to write into the Constitution equality of the sexes in education
Yes.
and employment. Okay. And quite another thing to put that into practice in everyday life. And as I pointed out, women in many ways, this rapid economic growth was highly gendered, and that this middle class lifestyle had came to have a kind of almost Victorian sort of public private dichotomy between gender roles, that men went out to work and women were expected to manage the domestic sphere, and considerable pressure could be put on them to do this. Okay, they did not enjoy, as I said, lifetime employment or bonus systems. They were not full-time employees. They were considered part-time employees in Japanese firms from the beginning, in the full expectation that by the time they hit their mid-20s or 30s, they would marry and leave their positions. So many, and if you just look at this, was reflected in education, okay, that women were much more likely to attend 2-year colleges and 4-year colleges. Okay, and these 2-year colleges were overwhelmingly female. They tended to focus on less academic subjects and more quote unquote practical subjects, which amounted to things like home economics and managing the household. Okay. On the other hand, if you look at the salaryman lifestyle and death from overwork, perhaps a lot of a Japanese housewife was not so deplorable. And in fact, sort of the ideal was a kind of corporate organization where women ran the household, men worked. Women often ran the household finances. Okay, so there's famous stories of men who have no idea how much money they make and they just get an allowance from their
Hmm.
wives. But the point is here that you know. Women or men didn't get to freely choose these career paths, that this was highly gendered in education and employment practices. And so most women had jobs, very few women had careers. And in fact, the current empress, Empress Masako, when she agreed to marry the current emperor Naruhito, then she had an economics degree from Harvard, and she was a career diplomat before she got married. And many feminists in Japan saw this as kind of a very bad precedent for women pursuing careers in Japan. And of course, we might as well mention that Takaichi Sanai is the first woman to hold the position of prime minister in Japan.
Which is, of course, as we know, without going into details, we know obviously For some feminists and women in Japan, they don't necessarily see it as a positive in the ways that we might in America. But that's a whole other complex discussion that we could get into.
Yeah,
Potentially, we might
you need a different
look
scholar
into
for that.
doing a gender roles in Japan webinar or women in Japan webinar in the future. Who knows? If there's interest in that, let us know. If I can ask just one last question, because we are over time, but there was a few comments and questions, and I myself was also curious. We could do a quick answer, maybe in potentially your thoughts on predictions. We had questions regarding Japan as a normal nation, if you will. Speaking of the reverse course, obviously we have to think of Article 9 in regards to these things. Obviously, we've seen how resistant the Japanese public has been to any potential change to this article, and quite proud of Japan's role as a peace nation post World War II. I personally think that's wonderful, but at the same time, I also, have studied politics. I recognize Japan's kind of difference compared to most nations due to Article 9. Um, what we have seen repeated pushes to reinterpret Article 9, change Article 9, remove Article 9. There's currently discussions about that now. Where do you see that discussion going? Is it inevitable that Article 9 will have to go away? Will it hold firm? What are your thoughts, if you don't mind me asking you a difficult question?
I don't, I'm not going to predict, but it's definitely not inevitable. And in fact, I think the obstacles to revision, substantial revision of Article 9 are pretty uh, high. First off,
Legally.
simply amending the Constitution is very difficult in Japan. Secondly, as you said, there seems to be considerable support for Article 9 and considerable opposition to revising it. Okay. People who are in Japan may know this better than me, but when I was living in Japan and I talked to people about this, my general impression that was that many people would not be averse to some change to Article 9 that recognized the existence and the legality of the Japan self-defense forces. And I think last time constitutional revision came up under Abe and the Komeito coalition government, that the idea was floated instead of revising Article 9, just add a sentence or a paragraph that recognize the legality of the self-defense forces. And it seems like, to me, my impression is that that would be more acceptable than a whole-scale revision of Article 9. I've also got the impression from talking to Japanese people that not a lot of Japanese people trust the LDP and the conservatives to do this. That I've seen public opinion polls that ask the question, would you favor a revision of Article 9? And then ask a follow up question, would you favor revision of Article 9 under the current LDP government? And the support rate for the second question is much lower. I even attended a talk, this was years ago, by Kono Yohei, where he mentioned the same thing. Part of the problem of revising the Constitution is that nobody trusts the LDP to do it. I think the LDP, I think it was 2010 or 12, the LDP released a potential draft constitutional revision that not only revised Article 9, but revised many of the civil rights clauses in the Constitution as well, including things like Article 14 and Article 24 about gender equality. And a lot of people, Japanese people, were not ready to sign up for that. So I think there's considerable
Mm.
obstacles to a whole scale revision of Article 9. One final point I'll make is, since you brought up interpretation of Article 9. Okay, remember that Japan, under the UN Charter, has the right to self-defense. Okay, and once you have the right to self-defense, I think we could go through history and come
You
up
would
with
be
a
able to
very
do
long
that.
list of wars that were fought
Yep.
in the name of self-defense. So revising Article 9 may not even be necessary in order to meet Japan's defense needs.
Mm. Very good point. I believe America recently acted in self-defense around Venezuela, right? So,
Yes.
there's a lot of interpretations on that. But without getting overly political in this talk, it was not a politics discussion today, generally more of a history discussion. Uh, I do want to say thank you, Dr. Hoppens,
Thank
for
you.
this great talk. Thank you so much, Dr. Hoppens, for today's talk. We really learned a lot from you. I want to say thank you to everyone for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing everyone at our next Getting to Know Japan event, as well as our next YCAPS events. Have a great day, everyone, and I hope everyone enjoyed the Emperor's birthday yesterday, by the way, in Japan. That's topical. Thanks, guys. Have a great day.
Thank you.
FadTech's IT support and mobile internet service helps make events like this one possible. Thank you.